I'm going to speak to some of the policies that came out of the Corbyn and Sanders moments. And I want to speak to their limits and then propose some alternatives in terms of taking them in somewhat different directions, but especially in terms of building on them. And like Leo, I'm doing this not so much in a sense of judging what's happening as soberly assessing it so we can learn and take it forward further. I want to start with just a couple of points about the context, this really difficult complexity of trying to make socialism because of all the uncertainties, because we're really inventing things that haven't been invented. And that's absolutely critical to keep remembering. One point is that revolutions are always premature. They happen before we're quite ready. Not only is capital still there, but the state doesn't have the kind of capacities because it's developed capacities to run and respond to a capitalist economy that we would need. The kind of capacities for planning, for democratic planning in particular, just aren't there. They have to be invented. And last but not least, the working class itself is likely, even when we come to office with their support, to be a mixed bag of people who want some immediate gains and people who have a deep commitment to socialism. So those are kinds of things we have to deal with. Part of that is that the situation we're in is that giant steps are essential or seem essential to really cope with everything in capitalism, to change it effectively, but they're not possible. We don't have the capacities to implement, the political capacities and the technical capacities in some sense to implement them. So we're left with small steps, but of course small steps can be swallowed up by the system. So we have to deal with that dilemma. And there's a dilemma that Leo raised about, we're talking about a long-term process that we want to continue, but which may be interrupted. And there's always the pressures to meet immediate demands. You've got elections coming, you've got workers who want immediate demands, but those immediate demands can only be met to a certain degree. So there's always this question of the long-term process that we have to gain people's commitments to. And crucially, the point that Leo made about Syriza, this dilemma between having to govern, when that itself is difficult because of the opposition and because of the capacities you have at the time, and also organize at the same time. And it's especially difficult because there is a bias for the people who are more interested in governing, who have the resources and the legitimacy of weight, we have to be elected, to have much more weight. So you need a party that is really thinking about, well, how do we really come through on this question of organizing? And the most important point, which I just want to reemphasize, which Leo highlighted a couple of times, but it's the most important strategic question, which is that lists of policies are one thing, but the real question is how do we build the kind of social force that can materialize those policies? How do we develop the capacities, the understandings, the coherence of the class, organizational capacities, its strategic capacities, its confidence. And at the same time, that is linked to transforming the state, to support that, but also to push for the transformation of the state. So let me get into the policies. The policies, all kinds of very important and good policies, especially this rejection of neoliberalism and raising expectations for something better, was obviously crucial, and winning reforms. But I think the most important questions that were asked in terms of policies were, how do we actually democratize capital? How do we take control over capital when we can't do it in one shot? How do we deal with the question of decent jobs and the environmental question, the Green New Deal? Those were kind of central tenets that had to be addressed. And this came out in terms of the democratic question, in terms of having workers sit more on boards, having workers get more shares, supporting co-ops and other forms of worker ownership, breaking up banks, looking to pension fund socialism, where we just take the assets and the pension funds, and that should give us the resources and the finance to do what we'd like to do. And then, of course, the Green New Deal as a catch-all for all kinds of things. Now, the limits on all of these, I'll go through them briefly. The limits of thinking in terms of workers sitting on boards is that corporations are much more complicated than just whoever sitting on the board has the power. It's a dense structure of power, and there's very little in the capacities that workers have developed under capitalism, which is one of the critiques of capitalism, that they can just walk in and take that over even if they're sitting on the board, given what power really means within a major corporation. Second of all, the question of shares as well doesn't get to the issue of real control. And most important is the fact that you have to look at the context of all of this. If this is still happening in a context where competition rules, then you're inevitably going to be putting the same kind of competitive pressures on workers. There's going to be pressures on them to identify with their own company. You're going to be fragmenting them alongside in terms of different workers who are in different situations and maybe getting higher shares or lower shares. And there's a danger of the workers actually being more integrated into their firms than significantly challenging them. And I'd really stress in that this question of competitiveness, which I don't think that when the left thinks about class, it thinks about class power, but it doesn't think about the fact that it isn't just a question of capital and labor. It's also the way the whole structure that both capital and labor fit into is based on competition and how crucial that is in shaping things. And the same is true of breaking up the banks. When you talk about breaking up the banks, what you're pointing to is, well, maybe we'll all be better off if we have smaller banks that are competing with each other. Not only is there a question of whether that would be stable or whether that wouldn't just lead to banks amalgamating again, but it's the question of, that's not the issue. The issue is making banks into a public utility. It isn't a question of breaking them up. In the question of pension fund socialism, there's a problem that workers who happen to have pension funds, which isn't a majority, might not be very happy about the monies they put into pension funds through postponed wages would be used for general social purposes. So at a minimum, what you'd have to address is, why just look at pension fund socialism? Why not put a levy on all financial institutions in the economy with the idea that workers that way would see the monies they put in leveraged, and then you would have some control over their pension funds. But you'd also have to ask about the relationship of pension funds to finance. If the point of really making a break, if the point is really to make a break, then you really have to think about not handing these funds over to finance, but thinking of an alternative to financial institutions. The Green New Deal, and I'll come back to some of this later, but you know, the environmental movement deserves enormous credit for having gotten the environment on the agenda and for having an ambitious program of a new Green Deal that covers not just jobs and addressing the environment, but doing it in a way that is egalitarian. That is crucial. The problem is that to tell workers that there will be a just transition is too vague. It doesn't engage them. It sounds like an abstract slogan. They don't see how you're actually going to implement them, because we're generally, when we're talking about a Green New Deal and we're trying to get a mass base for it, we're not explicitly addressing the fact that this is going to require major planning, and it's going to require a major challenge to private property. In addition to those limits, there's a general limit about not taking on finance. If finance is free to move, they ultimately are going to undermine what we're doing. It shifts the balance of power too profoundly. And so this question of capital controls and controlling finance is absolutely crucial, and I'll get back to that. So what is it that we can inject in this to go further? Corbyn and McDonnell in particular were critical of nationalized industries that weren't very democratic, and they were right to do that. We have to see those few industries that are nationalized, not that many in the United States, but where they are, as experiments where we really try to learn how you can do this in a democratic way, where the workers have a special role because of their specificity in running these industries, but you're also running it in terms of the interests of the community and the national interest. But where we don't have the capacity and the political power to actually extend nationalization very much, we should take a look at our social services. There are twice as many people employed in social services like education, health, and welfare programs than there are in manufacturing. We should be talking about and thinking through what would it really mean to democratize those services? How would we make them into having a relationship to the users through councils of some kind that could really bring us to the point of saying, well, we're actually changing the state because we're finding a new way of democratically linking workers, unions, and the users. So that's critical in terms of transforming the state, but it's also critical because there can be a great danger for public sector workers who see a favorable government to just see as an opportunity to act in their own interest. So it's also about transforming them. On the question of the banks, raising the question of banks becoming a public utility is absolutely fundamental, even when we don't think we can actually win it yet. The only way we can win it is to get it on the agenda and start discussing it so it's someplace that we're pointing to. What we can do in the interim is think about every time there's a crisis, banks get all these funds, they're bailed out. There should be a quid pro quo. Why isn't there a levy on all banks that we could use for creating a couple of particular public banks that are run on different principles, that have the funds so they don't have to compete, that are addressing infrastructure, that are addressing a Green New Deal? That would be critical. And then there's a question of starting in some way to move on capital controls. We cannot let the banks get the message as they did after the great financial crisis and get the message again that they can get this kind of support from the public. And then when things return to normal, they can just say, well, that was nice. Now we think we can leave. That can't happen. We need a wealth tax. And I want to make a couple of points about this. The case for a wealth tax is not hard to make, given the 1% of the population in the US having more than 90%, more wealth in the bottom 90%. In Canada, it's something like 5% of the population has more wealth in the bottom 90%. Looking at the wealth tax, looking at the question of how this reproduces intergenerational inequalities, looking at how much the inequalities have grown since the 1980s when they were already unequal, it's not hard to make the case for that. Part of the reason for doing this is because it's a political point, a little bit like Occupy. It's a point about keeping the question of inequality right up front on the agenda, how unequal the society is and how committed we are to doing something about it. Wealth tax would just be the start. You cannot let people make the kind of wealth they have and then think that you can then take it away after you've legitimated them making it. So you can do something quite significant. It's happened during war times when there were top tax rates of 94% after the Second World War, where there were excess profits tax. You can do those things, but you eventually have to talk about the structure of production. But I do want to raise one thing that I don't think the left talks about enough. And it's a tricky question. And that is that if you're going to have the kind of social programs we want, you have to talk about taxing workers as well. One of the points about a wealth tax is that you're leveraging all the money from the wealthy, so you can make a case for workers with middle income to say that, yes, you're going to be taxed, but it's going to leverage a lot of money from the wealthy. But the other point is that you're trying to shift culturally from an emphasis on individual consumption. So if you pay taxes, you have less money for individual consumption, but there are going to be more funds for collective consumption. It's a socialist principle, but it's also crucial to the question of the environment. On the environment, I think that the angle of emphasizing conversion gives us a real significant strategic point about addressing a whole host of issues. If we're really going to address the environment, it's not just a question of slowing things down, it's a question of fixing things. We need the material base to change everything about how we live, work, travel, play. We need a manufacturing capacity. And when we see plants closing because corporations don't want to invest or can make profits later, we should be jumping in and saying they're still productive, they still have great equipment, they're skilled workers, they should be converted to useful production. And what that starts getting us into is raising the question of property rights. They should be taken over in terms of public ownership. It gets into the question of you need to plan if you're going to deal with the environment. But if you're going to talk about conversion, you need to plan. It gets into the question of workers whistleblowing. If their plants are being run down and they can think of something better to do there, it gets into the question of why not think about conversion even in terms of things that are out there that we shouldn't be making, even though that is more difficult. It gets into the question of setting up a national conversion agency, transforming the state in terms of that kind of capacity, and having regional hubs where hundreds of young engineers are thinking about what could be made, what do people need, how do we convert places to this, what new technology do we need, what do we have to develop in terms of our productive capacity. It means that we can plug in all kinds of other things at the regional level in terms of how health is run or how food is administered and produced. So, and even with co-ops, the limit of co-ops is that they can just become businesses like other businesses, with some exceptions where people are doing it simply for a different lifestyle. But the potential of co-ops is if they're actually part of something that is a political movement, where they see themselves as part of a political movement, not a business that is on the margins trying to do something different, that is running educationals to give people both skills on running businesses, but also political education. Then you can imagine co-ops also being part of a plan that includes the state looking at procurement to support them, or looks to unions agreeing to support them because of their politics, not because they will save a few cents on it, but because you're contributing to something. So it is so crucial that we get out of this mode of competition and think through what are the mechanisms before we have everything taken over that we can begin to do those things. Now, I just want to conclude with the most important thing, because the most important thing, again, isn't at the level of policies. Policies are ways to raise questions. They're ways to do some education. There are ways to even talk about the limits of what we're doing so that people see, yes, we can get some things, but if we really want to go further, we have to challenge things more. There's no way out of that. But what we really need to do is to think about how we engage the working class. That's one of the advantages of conversion. You can actually look at specific things and deal with workers who are losing their jobs or thinking about losing their jobs and talk concretely about what you might do. But generally for the DSA, the critical question is how do we once again get embedded in a working class? How do we engage them in struggles and developing their capacities and the cultural changes? And I think this is more possible than it's been for a long time because the pandemic opened all kinds of questions. Capitalism was already losing a lot of legitimacy before the pandemic. Leo and I have argued that this question of the legitimacy of capitalism was the real crisis that had to be addressed, not a crisis of accumulation. And that because it wasn't being addressed, there was all kinds of delegitimation of political institutions, the judiciary, the police, the welfare bureaucracy, and of course, political parties. The pandemic increased that delegitimation, and that creates an opening. And in this period after the pandemic, and seeing now that there are some struggles emerging around questions like health and safety, I think that's absolutely critical. Obviously, the question of addressing strengthening the labor movement is fundamental. If we really want to talk about how we're going to do things, just in policy terms, aside from this question of engaging them in struggles and being embedded to the labor movement, we have to strengthen the labor movement. And I've always been skeptical about just saying we have to make it easier for unions to organize. Because when unions were strong, we had a reasonable amount of density in the US, they still stumbled in terms of fighting against free trade, in terms of thinking in class terms. And the trade union movement in Canada right now has almost double the density of the United States. And in spite of that, all the energy that we see is actually in the US. The reason for why pushing the Democrats to put this legislation in about making it easier for unions to unionize, including other progressive labor legislation like secondary boycotting and anti-scab legislation, is the labor movement has to be convinced that this is a unique moment when it can do something, that it's got a certain empathy after, the move towards frontline workers, that with the Democrats coming back, this is something that they are really owed, and this is the moment that they have to seize. And if they don't do that, they really are going to continue their slide. And if they do it, they're going to have to look back on history on how it's done, because it has to be a crusade. The miners in the 30s decided that they had to organize steel, and they put 100 people into the field. Unions are going to have to decide that organizing is the main thing that they can do. The opportunities are there with unorganized workers. And if they do this, it means that there will be new leaders emerging. It means that unions will begin to transform themselves because they'll have to change how they bring their workers into these kinds of struggles, where they put their resources. It's going to mean that the union movement is going to get new blood from new places that are going to be very excited when they get a new union. And it's going to mean that we're going to get a lot of potential sources of power. Having a union at places like Walmart and Amazon matter very much. I mean, one of the interesting things about what Leo and I have been saying and writing is that we didn't end with this question of should you leave the Labour Party or should you leave the Democratic Party? What we focused on is what should people in Momentum and the DSA do? And it seems that what their historical responsibility is to say capitalism has made a certain kind of working class. It didn't just happen. And as Leo's written elsewhere, social democratic parties were part of that making. We're really trying to rethink how to remake the working class. And the crucial thing for Momentum and the DSA is the extent to which they can organize themselves to focus on that task. And that, I think it has nothing to do with what social democracy, modern social democracy has been. And as Leo said, for historical reasons, it doesn't even seem like a choice. What else can you do right now but that? To talk about taking over the state and smashing, I mean, those are just abstract without showing that this can be done. Socialist consciousness in terms of the working class means that they are prepared for the risks that this will involve. If we think that we're going to win people to socialism simply by telling them, don't worry, when we take over, it'll all be wonderful. We'll just redistribute income, etc. There is going to be difficult transitions and people have to be, that's part of what education is about being honest with them. And I go one step further. There's a certain section of the left that thinks that when capitalism is falling apart, it is easy to win people over. And that's not at all obvious. On the one hand, people may say, I just want capitalism fixed. I'd rather go back to a certain kind of normality. And the main point is to really win people over to socialism, you have to convince them that even when capitalism is working fine on its terms, it's not the kind of society we want. And those are the really difficult educational tasks, I think.